Kalorama, a recorded books Highbridge imprint, presents The Pledge to America, One Man's Journey from Political Prisoner to U.S. Navy SEAL, by Drago Dzieran. Read by Joel Richards. Author's Note. This book is my memoir. It reflects my recollections of experiences over time. Some names and other identifying characteristics have been changed. Some events have been compressed, and some dialogue has been recreated. What you may currently understand as communism, Marxism, Leninism, or socialism may lead you to pause and question how I describe them. Please understand that Eastern European countries under the control of the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain are often referred to as communist. However, none of these states were ever communist. Instead, they were all socialist states run by communists and Marxists. This allowed communists, like my father, to control society and suppress any dissent or opposition, often in a violent way. Regardless of how you choose to accept the labeling, the terror that I and my family endured was real, and is described in this book in a way that I hope helps you visualize and connect with the true impact of these ideologies upon real people and society. Introduction. Iraq, 2004. As missions go, this one was standard. Approach the compound, breach the doors on the target's house with explosives, and detain the target, in this case a suspected terrorist. I was confident that it would go off without a hitch, as many of our previous missions in Iraq had. Working off reconnaissance photos of the compound, as a lead breacher, I had prepared the appropriate explosive charges and calculated the safest distance for the rest of the initial assault element to avoid getting caught in the blast. I designated a convenient, safe place that would keep us out of the way of the shock wave and any explosive fragments. It was right behind the corner of the building, between the wall and what looked like a concrete fence. The space was about 2 to 3 feet wide and 10 to 15 feet long, enough to safely stack the entire assault element together. We moved out just after 0200. We functioned seamlessly as a unit, pushing through the quiet, pitch-black night toward the compound rising out of the dusty Iraqi streets. Our orders were to capture or kill the target. We had confirmation that the terrorist was in the building. The assault element, including myself, scaled the 6-foot concrete fence in perfect silence, while the designated security element circled the walled compound to make the terrorist's escape impossible, if he decided to run. We hit the ground with barely a rattle. Within moments, I was shouldered up against the outer wall of a building just inside the fence, a string of men with me. With practiced movements, I set a breaching charge on the door, and on my signal, my security element and I began to walk back towards the designated space around the corner, where the rest of the assault element were already taking cover. The moment we began to move, however, I realized with a sinking feeling that the reconnaissance images I'd studied earlier hadn't shown the mound of rubble in that same corner between wall and fence. Shit. There was barely enough space left to cover most of the assault element. I wasn't going to fit, and there was no time to scale the concrete fence and take cover. It was a split-second decision. I backed myself as far from the door as possible and then dropped to my knees. I covered my face with my M4, curling up to protect as much of my body as possible. Based on careful calculations for the safe standoff, I knew I would still be relatively safe as far as the shock wave was concerned. I learned early on from my previous direct action missions to calculate the safe distance from breaching charges in 2 ways. One normally per the manual, and one for situations like this. For me. The second calculation was important for times when I may not make it to cover, but needed to have an absolute minimum safe distance. It was a distance from the breaching charge that could cause injury, but should not be incapacitating. I was hoping to never use it. Once I knew everyone had cover, I quietly passed the call over the radio. "Turning steel, turning steel, turning steel," and I detonated the charge on the door. The blast blew the fragments of the door out right over my head, with a thunderous sound that rattled my skull, a shock wave that felt like it lifted me off my knees, slammed me back onto the ground. I yelled, "Open, open, open," even as I tried to regain my footing, only to fall back on my hands and knees, bleeding from my nose and one ear. The breach blew the door wide open, and the rest of the assault element was forced to shove me out of their way as they rushed the building through the smoke. I don't remember pain in the moment. Pain is the last thing on your mind when you're in the middle of an operation. I rallied quickly enough and joined my team to clear the building, going room to room on autopilot, ears ringing. We caught our suspect without much struggle, and we returned to base on the high of a successful mission before the sun was even up. Later the next day, when the adrenaline had worn off, I checked myself. Some light bleeding from my nose and ears, unexpected side effect of taking a shock wave almost directly to the head. The ringing had subsided, but one ear was sore and difficult to hear out of, and I had a massive, vivid bruise on the side of my chest that I couldn't account for. I had been wearing steel-plated body armor during the op, but it only covered the front of my chest and my back. It was so sore and ugly-looking. I was worried that some fragments from the blast may have bounced off the wall and lodged in the side of my chest. But how could that leave such a massive bruise? Every breaching charge is carefully calibrated, and the one used during the op should not have resulted in any large fragments. Regardless, even a small fragment can maim or kill a person if it penetrates a vital organ or severs a major artery. Breaching steel doors, steel gates, or concrete walls is especially dangerous in that regard. As I inspected the big, ugly bruise on my side, a buddy, one of the Polish Grom guys, who was part of the assault element on that mission, came up to me and said, "Sorry, Drago. After the charge went off, you were right in our path, so we had to kind of kick you out of the way." Polish Grom, Polish Special Forces, are hardcore operators with impressive combat records. For an average person, a kick like the one I received would have easily broken some ribs or totally incapacitated a person. Luckily, I was bulky and had been practicing martial arts for most of my life, so I had some tolerance built in. My friend smiled, and I laughed. Turns out he was the foot behind my massive mystery bruise. It hurt, but there were no hard feelings. I would have done the same if our situations had been reversed. This is my story. It's not the story you might expect, coming from a Navy SEAL, but at a time when division and strife are rampant around the world, I think it's an important one to tell. Because just as no two SEALs are the same, neither are any two Americans, and I happen to be both. I was born in 1960 in Lodz, Poland, deep behind the Iron Curtain. It's important to tell this part of my story in full, and you'll hear about it in forthcoming chapters, because my life in Poland directly influenced my coming to America as a political refugee and asylum seeker. Now I consider myself an American through and through, American by choice. But having been born and raised in communist Poland, I know what it means to have next to nothing, no money, no safety, no rights, and what it means to come to a place that promises everything. I know how precious those things are, and how easily they can be lost, unless someone is willing to step up and fight for them. This is a story about a life spent fighting, which began well before I picked up a rifle to fight on America's behalf. In houses and classrooms, schoolyards and streets, I learned how to fight, and I learned what to fight for. I want you to understand that this is not a life I want for anyone, Polish, American, or otherwise. What I want is for no one to have to live like I had to growing up in communist Poland, a totalitarian, oppressive state. I don't want it for anyone, anywhere in the world, but especially not in America, the country that gave me a home after I lost mine. This memoir is a collection of unforgettable stories from my life. Political oppression and persecution, personal desperation, compassion, determination, and, ultimately, sacrifice and courage. This memoir is also my attempt at recalling my life in Poland. It is less about my SEAL experiences from my later years, and more about family, faith, and resiliency in the face of adversity. There are plenty of books by and about Navy SEALs, but I wanted to write a book that reflects on what it's like to live under some of the worst circumstances on the planet, and to then find freedom in America. If you came here looking for another typical SEAL memoir, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But I hope you will listen to this book regardless, and maybe come away with a better sense of who you share this beautiful country with, and how lucky we all are to live in the greatest country in the world. Because in the process of learning to be an American, I realized how incredible the American people really are. All of them, regardless of what they look like, how they pray, who they love, or how they vote. This is one country, and we are all Americans, and I am honored to fight for them. Chapter 1. A New Life. My life began in October 1960. 15 years after the end of World War II, Poland was still a place of desolation and despair. People were still trying to rebuild their lives after the Second World War, but this time under the terror of the totalitarian state run by communists and Marxists, like my father. That's where I spent the first years of my life, amid the rusting ruins of the old bombed-out Poland and the cheap scaffolding of the new. With me were my parents, Stanislav and Florentina Dzieran. Following my arrival, my brother Sławek and my sister Justina would join us 1 and 4 years later, respectively. Together we lived in a standard multifamily home, a 2-floor by-the-book communist build, in a town called Zielona Góra. We lived in the downstairs, which had 2 rooms for us, and a 3rd room for an unrelated single man, a single bathroom, and 1 rudimentary kitchen we all shared on the 1st floor. Upstairs there was a duplication of the downstairs floor plan, which another unrelated family occupied. There was no staying out of each other's hair with that many people in one house, especially when the subject of politics came up. My father, Stanislav, was a full-fledged member of the Communist Party in Poland, referred to as the Polish United Workers' Party. He was a well-respected high school teacher until he quit his job to become director of theaters and museums at the Polish Ministry of Art and Culture, working directly for the Polish government. He also worked as the director of the art history department at the University of Łódź. As a proud card-carrying communist, my father was afforded advantages and luxuries that non-party members in my country either didn't have or never hoped to get. Dad was fascinated by technology. Because of his status and connections within the party, he had all kinds of advanced cameras, so I'd often sneak into his closet and play with them. When I got bored, I'd drag his stuff around like a dog at the end of a leash. Eventually, he learned to hide things better. I wish I could say I knew my dad well. At the end of the day, he was a very distant man, not just to me, but to his entire family. Even from a young age, I only really knew him as a forceful, very logical man who'd show up at the house from time to time between his travels. He would yell at us when we did something wrong, and sometimes he'd hit us with his belt. In his environment, he was very accomplished and respected by the communist government. Conversely, my mother, Florentina, despised communism, Marxism, and socialism with a fiery passion. She saw the communist regime as nothing more than occupiers by a different name, like the Nazis during World War II and the Germans during World War I. She was a devout Catholic, too, which didn't sit well with my father, who believed, per the party line, that it was necessary for communists to be atheists. He was and remained an atheist until his death in 2021. My maternal grandmother, similarly, was passionate about church. She would have literally chased my father to church if she could. I remember on one particular Sunday morning when she came to visit, as my parents went through their usual back and forth about whether we children would be allowed to go to church that day, my mother grabbed me. Dad was standing in the front doorway, his arms stretched from door frame to door frame as an imposing figure that was not going to let anyone leave, and turned toward the window overlooking the street. To Dad's surprise, she proceeded to hand me straight through the open window to my grandma, who was waiting outside. We went to church. I was too small to remember the lessons from the service on those Sunday church visits, but they were important to my mother. Dad eventually learned to not interfere with our faith, but he never approved and barely tolerated it. He called it superstition and often ridiculed and disparaged it. And any Sunday that Grandma visited, we went to church. If Grandma wasn't there, we'd go in the evening when Dad was out or wasn't paying attention, but we'd never talk about it at home. I think I understood even from a young age why both my maternal and paternal grandmothers were so fiercely committed to their faith. My paternal grandmother had witnessed the communist state's brutal approach to violence during its initial rise. She knew people who were sent to Siberia, to the gulags, even some who were murdered outright for opposing communism. It must have been devastating for her to watch her own son embrace that ideology and join the party. My mother's mother, Grandma Miranda, had survived World War I, World War II, and Hitler's socialism, National Socialism. So she was hardly enthused by Stalin's version and later by Brezhnev's socialism. The communist regime used socialism to subdue society and gain control over the people. These ideologies always have a few of the same things in common: intimidation, political prisoners, political murders, cancellations of people inconvenient to the state, and censorship. My grandmother knew that when times get hard enough, gold and money mean nothing, while faith and belief in God are everything. The only thing that matters in those circumstances is survival, food, water, and shelter. She always saved as much food as possible. During World War II, people would often offer to pay her for a share, attempting to coerce her to sell food that she had saved for her children. But she never accepted it because her family couldn't eat money. She would only give out some bread from time to time to help others who were suffering. Sometimes, while out walking with my grandma, she would find bread on the streets and pick it up while complaining about the waste. Red with embarrassment, I would tell her to put it down while other kids pointed fingers at us and laughed. She'd drop it in a safe place and then say something like, "Well, at least the birds have something to eat. Never, ever throw food away." Despite the tension within the family, we had everything we needed growing up. What we wanted was irrelevant. We couldn't afford things like bicycles, so we rode ones that belonged to other kids. As a party member, Dad eventually got a car, which was unusual at the time. A cheap off-white Serena, two-doored with a two-stroke engine. That was luxury to us. Normally, people would have to prepay the full value of the car and then wait for 1 to 2 years to receive the car. However, my dad's position in the party allotted him access to goods much earlier and easier than others. The thing that sticks out in my mind the most about this time in my life is that we had to walk to kindergarten on our own. At 4 and 5 years old, we'd hold each other's hands, carrying our house shoes for school, and walk half a mile through a small field outside the apartment complex, across a big street, and all the way to kindergarten. We were essentially on our own. The adults just told us how to get there. I had my first brush with romance at all of 6 years old. We were in the same kindergarten class. You know how it goes. One minute we're playing doctors, and the next I'm getting kissed on the cheek and have a girlfriend. I think we lasted about a week. Naturally, kids find all sorts of ways to get into trouble, regardless of the times they live in. Once, playing with gasoline we drained from a parked motorcycle, a bunch of us set fire to it. The thing went up in a fireball and burned my eyebrows right off. On another occasion, while baking potatoes over an open fire, we managed to set fire to a wheat field. By the time the firefighters arrived, the field was completely gone. Some people tried to sue my mom and our neighbors for damages, but there was no money to get out of any of us. Besides, my father was able to squash it as a party member. Everything was swept under the table, and people who tried to complain were threatened and easily intimidated by the socialist state, which my father was part of. I don't play with fire anymore, and to this day, whenever I smell wood smoke, this exact memory comes back to me. It's interesting to me now to remember the places where my friends and siblings and I played when we were little kids growing up. A lot of old, dilapidated buildings from before the war were our playgrounds. For poor kids like my brother, sister, and me, the rusting ruins of destroyed textile factories and abandoned pre-war buildings were the only spaces for us to play in. Occasionally, new buildings under construction also served as a playground. At that time, everything seemed very large to us. Sometimes I go on Google Maps and look around that old town on Street View and see all the places where we used to hang out. Zielona Góra was granted town privileges in 1323. It has a long and compelling history. When I was growing up there in the 1960s, the city was a small, peaceful town with very little crime. The people's attitudes were different than today. It was okay for me and my siblings to wander around the town, fields, and woods without supervision. My mom let us play outside by ourselves with free rein, as long as we let her know where we were, and as long as we were back before dark. When I was 5 years old, my friend was struck and killed by a motorcyclist. I didn't see it happen, but I saw his body in the open casket at his funeral. It was a horrible sight, and not one I could easily forget. My mom became very strict about my getting to school safely after that. But we were kids, so we'd still mess around and play dumb games like who can get closest to the moving vehicle. Later, I would keep it secret from my mom that I'd gotten hit by a motorcycle too. I was walking out of my first grade class, feeling like hot shit. I thought I was so important and cool because my mom was a teacher at the school. She was a well-respected teacher in the school, and I felt that nothing could touch me. I started dancing in the street after I noticed some girls watching from the playground, and ended up getting clipped by this passing bike. It launched me onto the sidewalk, but I managed to bounce right back up. I was still rattled, though, and immediately ran off across the nearby field, jumped a fence, and sprinted until I was safe at home. When I did finally tell Mom that story, she gave me a sound spanking. Father refused to spend much money on our needs, so we couldn't afford to buy the state-required school uniforms, and our grandma, an accomplished seamstress, made them for us instead. The richer kids were quick to point out that our uniforms were not purchased and were homemade. Most of the kids at this time were wearing these homemade uniforms, and I decided to beat the rich kid who opened his mouth first about the uniforms. They left me alone, and I never heard about my uniform again. My grandmother had made mine and my siblings' uniforms with her pedaled sewing machine, and I would watch the wheel next to her foot go round and round. On one occasion, I happened to notice a pair of sewing shears lying on the floor next to her sewing machine. Stealing it out from under Grandma's nose, I whispered to my little brother, "Let's be barbers." We hid behind the sofa, and there I grabbed my brother by the hair on the front of his head and snip, snip, snip. He did the same to me, snipping away until Grandma, realizing it was far too quiet, jumped up and found us and a pile of hair behind the sofa. We looked like samurai with long hair on the sides, but no hair on the top of our heads. "Oh, my God, what did you do?" She called my mom into the room and told her what had happened. Thankfully, neither of us were physically injured by our antics. Mom sighed heavily and said, "I cannot take you out like this." She shoved hats onto our heads and dragged us to a real barber a few blocks away. Unfortunately, he took one look at my brother and me and said, "I can't do anything with this." There was nothing else to do. He buzzed our heads. Mom cried. On the dreary walk home, other women berated her for our buzz cuts, telling her, "How could you let these boys walk around looking like criminals?" I hadn't thought of that comparison at the time, but what a thing to hear. And, as if to add insult to her injury, Mom never stopped giving me grief about the fact that my hair grew back in straight and brown, after I'd originally had such beautiful curly blonde hair. During my primary school years, my mom taught at the same school I was attending, which meant my antics were met with punishment a lot faster, too, and with a lot more embarrassment involved. In our underground classrooms, we'd regularly watch for the teacher's arrival through thick, half-buried windows, scanning constantly for ankles while we screamed and laughed and teased each other. When one girl made a joke about another girl in class having a crush on me, I puffed up and said, "I don't need a girl," and then I went up to the girl accused of having a crush on me and kicked her right between the legs. I was violently obstinate. Even as the nurses carried her away crying, I shouted, "She's not my girlfriend!" I went back to class, and then my mom showed up. It was like the air was suddenly sucked out of the room. She glared right at me, hands on her hips. "Who did you hurt?" The whole class pointed at the girl sobbing at the nearby desk. My mom immediately grabbed me by my ear and neck and pulled me to the front of the room, where she proceeded to spank me in full view of the entire class, so hard and for so long that I broke down and started to cry. After a while, she released me and told me to apologize. The class was silent. I apologized through my tears, and my mom set me back down at my desk before leaving. That day, my mother, besides being a very well-respected teacher, liked by many students, became a teacher that was feared. None of the kids ever wanted to get on her bad side and test the rules after seeing what happened to me. When I returned home at the end of school, my mom had an hour-long conversation with me, spanked me some more, and I never hit another girl again. Corporal punishment was the go-to method in those days, and it was used often, even for minor infractions. If a student ever refused to answer a teacher's question, or answered rudely, the class would go perfectly still, and he would be hit with a wooden ruler on his hand. His ear would be stretched as he was dragged out of the room and spanked. Then he'd return to class with tears running down his splotchy face. He'd apologize for not learning and for mouthing off, and then very carefully sit back down in his assigned seat. Never mess with teachers in Poland. Funnily enough, though, the punishment only sometimes managed to deter us from bad behaviors in the long term. It was around this time that my brother and I discovered how fun it was to play hooky. All the bigger kids took over the coolest parts of the play sets, and the younger kids were typically pushed to the side, forced to only sit and watch. One morning when we walked by the empty playground on the way to school, we decided to play hooky. So instead of going to class, we took a detour and went to the kindergarten playground, hidden from prying teachers' eyes behind a bunch of trees. And we'd play our hearts out. We had so much fun until the angry teachers burst out of the trees and grabbed us both by the waistbands of our cheap pants and all but carried us back to class. Mom would get on the phone and yell at us. We kept doing it, trying not to get caught.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?